Some just count tanks. Others steal blueprints for nuclear bombs. The Cold War is the battleground for thousands of spies and spotters.
Both sides collected intelligence in order to avert what was considered to be a looming war.
The secret services have few scruples when it comes to procuring intelligence. They pay for acts of treason which may spell death for those exposed.
Do I have an awareness of blood guilt? No. No, I didn't.
They were spooks with a license to spy. The men of the Allied Military Liaison Missions in Germany were at the forefront of the intelligence war between East and West. Yet even today, hardly anything is known about their feats.
No other Western intelligence service got as close to Soviet military equipment.
But where there are secrets, there's danger too.
We knew that Soviet sentries were trigger-happy. They tended to shoot first and ask questions later, if at all.
Kalashnikov stuck in my neck, okay, so you don't move, okay?
The risks were pretty enormous. In fact, how on earth I'm still alive, in fact, how on earth any of us are still alive, I have no idea.
They were friends, and I understand what it takes to lose a friend, a close friend, for this matter.
It's a tour that brings back memories to three Cold War veterans. White gloves would have been reserved for parades, since their targets were out in the field. Their job was military intelligence, their brief, covert observation. Lawrence G. Kelly, a former US Marine, Jean-Paul Staub of the French Army, and Nigel Dunkley of the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards. They're browsing through dossiers that were once top secret.
We actually served as a kind of carpet sweeper, vacuuming up everything that might be relevant, because we never knew until the end what was most important.
The threat posed by Soviet military power is precisely documented in the old files. It's familiar stuff to Staub and Dunkley. Both men were tank experts. As only close-up photographs would do, they had to sneak up to their targets. A risky business. Shots from a film showing the British military mission in action. A tank crew has spotted the snoopers. A soldier is approaching fast to apprehend them. It's only by a hair's breadth that the Brits succeed in getting away. Sometimes they take even greater risks. Like when they were inspecting the inside of a tank.
They climbed onto the tank, opened the hatch, and were stunned to see that the crew was asleep inside. So they very gingerly closed the hatch, dismounted the tank, and made their getaway.
The officers of the military missions are out to get at the military secrets hidden deep inside the GDR, the Soviet-controlled eastern part of Germany. Their weapons, cameras with special lenses. The missions had been established due to an agreement between the Allied powers of World War II, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. That was back in 1944. Procedures were implemented the following year after Hitler and Germany had been defeated.
The intention had not been to create an intelligence apparatus, but to use the missions as relays between the supreme commands in occupied Germany.
The reason for the mission to be established, it's absolutely obvious, because we had 4 headquarters, 4 commands in Germany, and they had to communicate, they had to liaise.
There are countless issues to take care of across the occupation zones. Provisioning the populace, coping with millions of refugees, tracking down war criminals, and the repatriation of POWs.
Es ging also dieses gesamte halbdiplomatische.
So the missions had a semi-diplomatic, semi-military brief with a view to getting the Allied administration of the 4 zones working as well as possible.
Yet, with the advent of the Cold War, the victors soon turn into adversaries. The missions begin using their status to collect military intelligence. The Western Allies make forays into the former Soviet zone, now the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, while their Russian counterparts roam the newly founded Federal Republic. It's an explosive game, part diplomacy, part espionage. There are some restricted areas which are off limits. As for the rest, it's "thou shalt not be caught." Since their official duty is still to liaise between the occupation powers, the members of the missions enjoy special privileges.
They had the same status as diplomatic couriers. Otherwise, they had complete diplomatic immunity. You cannot search them, you cannot detain them, so there are many things. And they had free travel possibilities throughout the country.
So, Americans, Britons, and Frenchmen, each accredited by the Supreme Command of the Soviet Army, are entitled to regular forays into East Germany. The Western missions are based in Potsdam, near Berlin. 63 of their members are officially listed for the so-called tours under diplomatic status. The Soviets set up their respective camps in the former American, British, and French zones of occupation in Western Germany. Both sides soon make use of their diplomats in field dress to systematically spy on the other side. Their observations are a welcome addition to the output of classical espionage. The most sensitive area during the early years of the Cold War is nuclear research. At this stage, only the USA has the capability of delivering an A-bomb. Yet spies such as Klaus Fuchs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, or Rudolf Abel are risking their lives enabling the USSR to become a nuclear power. August 1945. Americans celebrate the victory over Japan and the end of World War II. 3 weeks later, a Soviet cipher clerk in Canada switches sides. When they debrief him, Western counterintelligence experts are alarmed. For the rest of his life, Igor Guzenko will only appear in public heavily masked. The defector has good reason to fear the revenge of the KGB, since he has alerted Washington to the presence of countless Soviet moles in American institutions.
Guzenko was a key figure in a process which could be described as the discovery of the Soviet Union as an aggressive, expansionist dictatorship. His interrogation helped expose a network within the Canadian, but most of all within the US administration, whose branches, and I mean nearly all of them, were infiltrated by communists.
The Guzenko file triggers an all-out counter-spy offensive against suspected communists throughout the United States. The secrets of the nuclear program are at stake, especially since American engineers are testing ever more powerful bombs over the Pacific Ocean. Possession of the A-bomb is crucial for the balance of power during the Cold War. As long as the United States is the sole nuclear power, its position is nearly unchallengeable. From the American perspective, it's a state of affairs best kept that way as long as possible. In 1950, the FBI exposes a spy ring centered around Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. The couple had passed secret information about the American nuclear program on to the Soviet Union.
The Rosenbergs themselves were comparatively small fry. Their prominence is mostly due to their spectacular trial and its circumstances. The prosecution succeeded in presenting a star witness from inside the spy ring, Rosenberg's brother-in-law. To save his own skin, he testified, and this, of course, meant that others would take the rap.
David Greenglass, Julius Rosenberg's brother-in-law, had provided the secret documents. Yet there are other more important nuclear spies working for Moscow. In 1949, the Soviets successfully test a nuclear device. Without their American informers, they might have needed several years more of their own research. Their most important source of information is Klaus Fuchs, an exiled German physicist working for the Manhattan Project, America's nuclear program, and a member of the German Communist Party since 1933. In 1949, by then in Britain, he comes under suspicion. He hands himself in and is sentenced to 14 years in prison.
The explanation for this comparatively light sentence, far below the death penalty, is quite simple. Fuchs had committed treason, yes, but the beneficiary of his betrayal had been an Allied power, since from 1941 until the end of the war, the USSR had been fighting on the side of Britain.
An extenuating cause that is denied to the Rosenbergs. They are executed for having spied for the new arch-enemy of the United States.
The verdict on Mrs. Rosenberg was a judicial crime. She should never have been sentenced to death, since her involvement had been a relatively minor one.
But the court was determined to set an example.
Julius and Ethel Rosenberg had paid their debt to society with their lives.
Their execution is portrayed as a fitting punishment for having betrayed the United States. (1985). US military spotters on tour in East Germany, keeping a low profile while trying to catch a glimpse of the Soviets' brand new main battle tank. Stalking a tank had its risks. Watching videos from the 80s, military mission veterans Dunkley, Kelly and Stobe recall what it was like to sneak up on their prey. A Soviet-built T-80, a prime catch.
T-80 was hot. T-80 was the brand new tank, and it was the pride and joy of the Soviets at the time. And it was a pretty bad shock for NATO to discover it was good. It was an outstanding tank.
The fire control system of the T-80 was very important as well. Tank modernization in GSFG was well underway, and this was a critical aspect of it.
Major Arthur D. Nicholson and his driver, Jesse Schatz, are approaching a tank firing range near Ludwigslust in northeast Germany.
We knew that Soviet sentries were trigger-happy. They tended to shoot first and ask questions later, if at all.
Yet Nicholson has set his mind on the tank's hangars, which are next to a restricted area. The two men scan the surroundings for Soviet sentries.
Sometimes the area, the training area I mean, was sensitive and sometimes it wasn't. But we all knew that a sentry was normally posted there.
Lawrence G. Kelly flew attack jets with the Marines before he was posted to the American military mission in Germany. By 1985, Kelly is second in command. Nick Nicholson has become a good friend of his. Kelly knows only too well what happened that Sunday afternoon. 4 months earlier, a tour of the French military mission had come under fire near those very hangars. Nicholson isn't in the least deterred by the accident. Quite the contrary.
Possibly that could have indicated that something important really was there, and I'm certain that Nicholson considered that point.
Hardly recognizable under its tarpaulin, a T-80. To a military spotter, a first shot is like a trophy. The Soviets had begun to deploy their most modern tank in the southern parts of East Germany. By 1985, there are rumors of its presence in the north, but there is no proof yet. NATO's headquarters want just that, visual evidence. Nicholson probably hopes to find it right here, near Ludwigslust. Nicholson and Schatz do not detect any sentries around, but there is one, a bit further off in the bushes. Nicholson advances to reconnoiter the area behind the hangars.
Nicholson was proud, well-educated, motivated, and ambitious. And in my opinion, he had an above-average affinity for risky actions.
Whatever he may have seen there, he decides to retreat.
But the sentry had indeed seen the tour, and relatively early. And he reported that fact to the guard officer over a system like a field telephone. Missia, he said, a mission tour is in the area. And the guard officer asked, well, where is it now? And the sentry replied, it's gone. To which the guard officer answered, well, when it comes back, you know what to do.
Nicholson and Schatz do indeed return, but the sentry doesn't know how to proceed in accordance with standing orders. And even if he does, he doesn't adhere to the rules. He watches on as Nicholson gets out of the car again. Then things get out of hand.
Come back!
Shots ring out. Nicholson is hit by a bullet. The sentry holds Schatz at gunpoint, keeping him from administering first aid. When a physician arrives an hour later, Nicholson is already dead.
Schatz detected the sentry at essentially the same instant with the first shot, and he ducked. The shot whizzed narrowly over his head. Either the second or the third shot hit Nicholson's center of mass, below the heart and somewhat inside the rib cage.
Sergei Savchenko remembers the events well. In March 1985, he is stationed in Wunsdorf, the seat of the Soviet Supreme Command in East Germany. He's an interpreter with the section dealing with the Western military missions.
When I came, I think it was something like between 6 and 7 p.m. to the headquarters, I didn't have any idea what was going on. And I could see that everybody was excited.
While his superiors hasten to Ludwigslust, he handles any incoming news. This way, Savchenko soon gets first-hand knowledge of what has happened.
When they came to Ludwigslust, to the place itself, of course, everybody was shocked because to see the body lying almost next to the vehicle, and to see Jesse Schatz inside, and a group of Soviet officers around.
Photographs that have long been top secret. It soon becomes obvious that procedures have been gravely mishandled. And not only by the sentry.
If you put a sentry with a weapon, with ammunition, anywhere, according to the Russian regulations, it has to be a post. And this post has to be clearly marked on the ground, on the terrain. There has to be a fence or a barbed wire. There were no signs, there was no fence, there was no nothing. And the sentry was nowhere to be seen.
Jesse Schatz is kept in the car for 6 hours. That is how long it takes Lawrence Kelly and his boss, Colonel Lajoie, to reach the site. Only to be confronted by Soviet officers with allegations that the Americans alone are responsible for what has happened.
The argumentation became incandescent, with extraordinarily sharp accusations, and the tension mounted continuously. The Soviets initially demanded to detain and interrogate Schatz, to seize and search the vehicle, and to perform an autopsy on Nicholson's body.
The Americans reject the Soviet demands. They merely agree to a joint autopsy.
Nicholson's body was transported back to a Soviet morgue in Potsdam in a Soviet ambulance, and I escorted him. Colonel Lajoie had given me the mission of ensuring that Nicholson's body was accorded the proper respect.
It's a somber drive to Potsdam. Kelly is cowering inside the Soviet ambulance next to his friend's body.
Underway, I looked at Nicholson again and again, and mentally asked him each time, "Nick, how could this possibly have happened?"
The death of Major Nicholson turns into a major incident. His coffin is transported back to the United States, observing full military honors. Nicholson is survived by his wife and their only child. The government pays its respects to him as a fallen hero.
Major Arthur Nicholson was an outstanding officer, murdered in the line of duty. We grieve with his wife and small daughter. We can only hope that the Soviet Union understands that this sort of brutal international behavior jeopardizes directly the improvement in relations which they profess to seek. Our deep sympathy goes to all his friends and relatives. May he rest in peace.
3 years will pass until the Soviet authorities half-heartedly acknowledge their responsibility for the shooting of an American officer in peacetime.
I said to myself, why cannot we admit that the soldier was not the best soldier in the Soviet army? And in fact, he was not the best soldier in the Soviet army. If we admit that, then we can say to the Americans, we're sorry it happened, but it happened because we had a bad soldier and because we had an inadequately organized post. That's it. It will not affect the relations between our countries, because in any army you can find a bad soldier.
Due to their briefs, Savchenko and Kelly meet regularly. As interpreters for their respective top brass, they even begin to appreciate each other. Yet for Lawrence Kelly, the tragic death of Nick Nicholson still casts a long shadow.
It's dramatic, and I understand the reason why Larry Kelly speaks about all that with such passion. They were friends, and I understand what it takes to lose a friend, a close friend, for this matter.
Major Arthur Nicholson paid with his life for trying to photograph a Soviet tank. The Allied Museum in Berlin. Lawrence Kelly, Jean-Paul Staub, and Nigel Dunkley stand in front of a display case remembering Jesse Schatz. The tragedy near Ludwigslust affected him badly. Up until then, he was known as an easygoing guy full of clever ideas. Like hawking so-called Berlin watches to tourists. Larry Kelly still recalls the details.
Schutz was a natural-born wheeler-dealer. He peddled trinkets of various kinds in the mission and at flea markets all over Berlin. Souvenirs mostly, sometimes watches. Problem was that his business, as he performed it, was only marginally legal, if at all, and the command ultimately told him to cease and desist.
Former Staff Sergeant Schutz died in 1996 at the age of 42. A candy bomber. A reminder of the Berlin airlift, 11 dramatic months which marked the beginning of the Cold War back in 1948. Intelligence about the intentions and capabilities of the other side now becomes of paramount importance. Thousands of agents and spies risk their lives to bring it home to their masters. The airlift ensures the freedom of more than 2 million people. The Soviet stratagem to strangle West Berlin has failed. Yet, as tension between the opposing power blocks mounts, so too does the hunger for secret information.
Es ging Wissen, es ging Gewissheit.
Both sides collected intelligence in order to avert what was considered to be a looming war and to achieve more safety for their own side. That's why, apart from so-called open sources, you'd want additional secret information. And that was the province of the intelligence services and the military missions.
Thus, Berlin becomes the hub for military reconnaissance men, secret agents, and informers of all kinds. April 1953. 7 British subjects return home from the Korean War. For almost 3 years, they had been held captive by the communist regime in the north. Among the returnees, here in the centre, is George Blake, an operative of MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service. There may be no sign of it yet, but he has come back to work as a mole for the KGB, Russia's secret service. 3 years later, in East Berlin, a 450-metre tunnel is triumphantly exposed by the communist media. Americans and British had combined to tap telephone cables on the other side of the Iron Curtain.
The Berlin Tunnel was an operation whose sheer size was, and still is, without precedent. Planning included, it ran for more than 2.5 years, and it tied up enormous resources in terms of money and personnel-wise, both British and American.
Moscow accuses the West of a warlike act. The CIA and their counterparts at MI6 had driven the tunnel from west to east with utmost care. Yet Blake blows the operation long before the tunnel is finished. For the time being, however, his masters let their opposite numbers carry on with their eavesdropping. The output seems well worth the effort. 50,000 magnetic coils of telephone calls, mostly between military stations.
Even today, after many files have been declassified, the CIA still maintains that they were able to retrieve a treasure trove of information out of these more than 500,000 recorded phone calls.
Yet why does the KGB let this continue for so long? Even if they managed to plant some amount of disinformation on the eavesdroppers, there are still several 100,000 genuine phone calls for their enemies to analyze.
Soviet intelligence had decided to sacrifice their own military secrets to protect their source, George Blake. This is the most plausible explanation.
For the KGB, it's a move that pays off. Blake exposes countless MI6 operations, even betraying agents in Eastern Europe, agents he himself has recruited. In 1961, the mole's cover is blown. Blake is sentenced to 42 years in prison. In 1966, he pulls off a spectacular escape.
His escape is basically an extension of his experiences in the war. He had been a prisoner of war in North Korea. He had had to survive under the most adverse conditions. There was torture, all these things. You don't know if you'll ever get out alive. But he had survived, and this had made him feel that he could cope with anything. He never ceased to believe in himself. To him, it was just another kind of war, and he wanted to win that war for his own sake. And that meant escaping from jail.
Blake scales the prison wall and escapes to Moscow. What had made him a traitor in the first place?
I
wonder if Blake ever was on the British side. He was a Brit, of course, but in his autobiography, he states right at the beginning that he was convinced that the world in peace is only possible under communism, and that he wanted to contribute to changing the world order in this direction.
Blake uses his occasional appearances in front of a camera to justify his actions. That his acts cost former colleagues their lives, this is not something he's wanting to hear. North of Magdeburg, a museum of Soviet trucks and other military hardware. Nigel Dunkley, Jean-Paul Staub, and Lawrence G. Kelly close up with their former objectives. Among them, the redoubtable air-to-ground missiles of the SA-6 series.
It was the first time that I'd seen the SA-6 this close. It was an extremely powerful weapon system, and definitely one of the best of its era.
On the grounds of the former Soviet barracks, the three Cold War veterans look on with professional nostalgia as the curator unpacks the once closely guarded components. Electronic modules which set the frequencies at which the missile received its target data.
Well, we would have been very happy to bring that back to Berlin.
Devices like these were of prime interest to NATO experts. To procure them was easier said than done.
Analysts in various headquarters always had wish lists, and justifiable wish lists. But they couldn't possibly know the risks that we would have had to run to make their wishes come true. Fulfilling some of them would have been tantamount to suicide.
That's why the decision as to whether the potential results were worth the risk was left to the men on the ground. But the expert's eye detects some intriguing details about the missile's origin.
I had my doubts, because the color of the equipment, the lighter green, was not usual for Soviet forces. Soviet equipment produced in the Soviet Union and used in Soviet forces was normally darker.
And indeed, apart from some labeling in Cyrillic, there is faded lettering in Polish. To Lawrence Kelly, it's clear evidence that the missile originally belonged to a unit of the Polish army. His hunch was right. The Warsaw Pact Army's air-to-ground arsenal ranked high with NATO reconnaissance. Over Vietnam, as well as in the Middle East, Soviet-built missiles had proven to be a deadly weapon. Electronic countermeasures may enhance the pilot's chance of survival. Their development, however, depends on exact data on the setup of a missile. At the close of the 1950s, the Americans' U-2 is regarded as the ultimate spy jet. Out of reach for any missile, they fly over testing areas, nuclear factories and military bases. Their pilots regularly venture into Soviet airspace with a sense of impunity, photographing from a height of 20 kilometers. Until May the 1st, 1960. To Francis Gary Powers, it's just another mission. Yet this time, the Russians have a surprise in store. When the U-2 crosses the Urals, they launch their latest anti-aircraft missile. Powers is lucky to be able to eject and to survive the descent, hanging on his parachute. To the Americans, it's a most embarrassing incident, forcing them to cancel all further spy flights over Soviet territory. On August 19, 1960, Powers is tried for espionage by a military court. The Soviet authorities make full use of the opportunity to brand the United States as warmongers. Powers is sentenced to 10 years in prison. 3 years later, another trial in Moscow, this time in the dock, Oleg Penkovsky, a high-ranking officer of the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Service. He had switched sides and betrayed information about Moscow's nuclear potential, which had been cause for deep-seated fears in the West for more than a decade.
Penkovsky had access to highly sensitive material, but most notably about the development of missiles and their intended deployment. To the Americans, this was, of course, of the utmost importance.
The cause of Penkovsky's treason? He had felt slighted by his superiors.
Penkovsky, by then a colonel, was expecting his promotion to general. He had had a fine career, but suddenly found himself at a dead end after a security check had revealed that his father had been a general in the Tsar's army. From then on, his promotions came to an abrupt end. His career was more or less over, and that's what made him break his allegiance to his country.
In 1960, Penkovsky contacts the other side and delivers detailed insights into Moscow's military arsenal. Types of missiles, their range and numbers, plus information about the air defense system which blew the U-2 out of the sky. Penkovsky also warns of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's aggressive nuclear policy. 2 years later, U-2 planes spot Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. American analysts identify them as SS-4 and SS-5, which can carry their warheads as far as Chicago. Thanks to the information supplied by Penkovsky, the photo interpreters know exactly what to look for, since each type of missile requires a distinct setup.
And this was the pattern that Penkovsky had passed on to the Americans. Once their experts had found it on the aerial photographs, they knew that this was a launch pad for a specific type of medium-range missile.
US President John F. Kennedy imposes a naval blockade around Cuba.
Should these offensive military preparations continue, thus increasing the threat to the hemisphere, further action will be justified.
The world is on the brink of a nuclear war. Skillful diplomacy and a good deal of sheer luck avert a nuclear apocalypse. Penkovsky is arrested a few days prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis, tried, and sentenced to death as a traitor. The impacts of his treason are far-reaching. Both sides begin to build and deploy intercontinental ballistic missiles. Back then, there is no chance of intercepting them. He who shoots first dies second. Yet there are new, highly efficient tools for reconnaissance and espionage. Satellites orbit the Earth and capture stunning high-resolution images. In August 1960, the Americans launched their Corona program. Its satellites can monitor the Soviet Union without any interference from below. The capsules containing the exposed shots still have to be ejected by the satellites and picked up in mid-air. Both sides expend billions on their respective programs, but the satellites prove to be superb guardians against any surprise attack. The quality of their photographs improves rapidly. As a consequence, both sides try hard to conceal their secrets by camouflage. And to catch a glimpse, you need agents on the ground, just like the officers of the military missions in both parts of Germany. Each vehicle transporting sensitive equipment was issued with cloaking devices. Tarpaulins were a must, and a challenge for snoopers who would pride themselves on being able to sniff out what was underneath.
Tarpology was an art form.
In order to become a master of tarpology, you had to learn by heart every single type of camouflage used to cloak the other side's weaponry.
We had to know what was underneath the tarpaulin, and so we did.
Now, the Soviets had various ways and means of camouflaging and disguising their equipment. It was all part of what they called maskirovka, but they didn't fool us. In the end, we could identify virtually everything.
Oh, yes. We most certainly did.
Even if they had to resort to cutting holes in the tarpaulin. Spy planes come in many guises. In the airspace around Berlin, the Western missions use small aircraft to peek down into Soviet army barracks or to shadow their opponents' field exercises. The air corridors to West Berlin, too, are systematically used for covert reconnaissance, focusing on military infrastructure on the ground. There are 3 corridors, each 32 kilometers wide. A fifth of eastern Germany can thus be photographed, practically without any risk. Yet there are incidents. The RB-66 is a highly specialized reconnaissance plane. In 1964, one of them shows up in the middle corridor heading for West Berlin. US Air Force footage gives a rare impression from inside the labs for high-end espionage hardware, as it was installed in an RB-66 jet. There are cameras, antennae, sophisticated radar, jamming devices, signal recorders. Yet the corridors aren't meant to be spy lanes. Any suspected bending of the rules may lead to a dangerous encounter. In March 1964, Wolfgang Preissler is working as a chauffeur with the US mission when he gets the order to take a tour officer to the crash site of an RB-66 near Gardelegen, in the middle of a restricted area. A tricky proposal.
The likelihood of being able to to stay undetected was very slim. So we knew that, but we did get within probably 100 yards, 100 meters of the crash site, because we were able to see the embers.
Preisler and his tour officer are pondering how to best approach the crash site proper, since some distance off the area is crawling with soldiers. Then they notice something quite unexpected. The trees around them seem decorated as if for Christmas.
A bunch of silver confetti hanging off the trees, and which was a little odd. And only shortly, 5 minutes after we picked off some of these pieces and looked at them and wondered, where they had come from.
The RB-66 had probably released the tinfoil as chaff in an attempt to blind the Russian radar, alas, without success.
There was only minutes thereafter that the Russian soldiers came and blocked our car from the front, from the back, and they detained us for about 12 hours.
The 3-man crew of the shot-down jet are released a few days later. They had survived thanks to their parachutes. One of them, however, is severely injured. The Americans deny any allegation that this had been a reconnaissance flight. According to them, the jet had strayed due to a compass error, unnoticed by the crew. The Soviets are anything but convinced. Sergei Savchenko, at the site of his former duty station. In his role as an interpreter with the staff of the Soviet Supreme Command in East Germany, he had become quite familiar with the routines of the Western military missions.
Basically, we kept track of the activities of the mission members, of their pranks, their exploits, their deeds, his behavior. My room was number 13. The boss's room was number 12. In the corner, we had Mr. Ludomersky, Colonel Ludomersky office. And he was nicknamed Colonel Schlagbaum. Schlagbaum because his service was responsible for the Glinica Bridge passage.
The checkpoint at Glinica Bridge is the gate through which the Western missions enter East Germany to proceed to their assigned areas of operation. Every car is registered by the authorities. Whenever a mission tour passes the bridge, units of the East German state security are waiting for them. It's the start of a never-ending game of cat and mouse between the snoopers and their shadowers. On February 10th, 1962, the bridge between East and West makes international headlines. A few minutes before 9 a.m., 2 men are led towards the middle of the crossing. On one side, there is Gary Powers of the notorious U-2 incident. At the other end is Rudolf Abel, an illegal KGB resident in the United States whose cover was blown in 1957. Ironically, neither side was sure that the exchange really was a good deal.
The Americans were gravely concerned whether Powers might, at some point, have disclosed vital information to his Soviet captors. Their interrogation methods, to which he surely would have been exposed, were notorious. Doubts were also fueled because he'd let himself be captured alive instead of taking the suicide pill he'd been provided with. That was held against him, as well as the fact that he didn't trigger the automatic self-destruct of his U-2. And so he kind of fell into disgrace.
Umstände, die Powers haben in Ungnade fallen lassen.
The suspicion that Powers might have talked, however, is not confirmed by later research. At the time of his arrest, Rudolf Abel is regarded as the most important KGB operative in the field of nuclear espionage. He avoids the death penalty, but only just. His sentence, 40 years in prison, may well have shown that he was more useful to his captors alive in the event of a future spy exchange.
Seine Aufgabe war ja nun
His brief had been to sort of resurrect a network of nuclear spies from the wartime period and to work as an illegal resident in the USA, behind enemy lines, so to speak. That's what the KGB had trained him for and why they subsequently sent him to America. Yet, it's a gross misunderstanding to see Arvel as this master spy. During the 9 years he resided in the USA, he did not personally recruit one single new agent. The Americans had been expecting much more from him in terms of information than he could deliver. He just didn't know very much.
So the famous exchange on Glienicke Bridge merely repatriated two men who, each in their own way, had disappointed their masters. But the CIA, as well as the KGB, had no choice. Those who let their agents down won't find any new recruits. The Bridge of Spies, a symbol of the Cold War. Time and again, Nigel Dunkley, Lawrence G. Kelly, and Jean-Paul Staub set out from here into East Germany. They belonged to a hardly known elite of intelligence gatherers. Who roamed enemy territory. They don't think of themselves as spies. Their tours, they say, had been perfectly legal, accredited by the Soviets. Some covert observation, yes, of course, but in a struggle for information, it's the results that count. And, as they see it, they managed to deliver.
We observed the Soviets up close and personal, as the saying goes, and knew the realities of their armed forces better than anyone else. Our knowledge was practical, not theoretical, and we provided our authorities with an unbiased, first-hand, boots-on-the-ground assessment of Soviet military capabilities, which was very important at the height of the Cold War.
Whether uniformed snooper with a diplomatic passport or top agent undercover, the bridge at Glienicke has seen them all. Intelligence gatherers on dangerous missions across secret fronts.